The sale of Joseph. The story of how Joseph was sold by his brothers into Egypt, recorded in Genesis 37, is well known to anyone who went through Sunday school. The basic idea is that Joseph's brothers didn't like him, so when he approached them after he'd been sent to look for them, they decided to kill him and chuck him in a pit. A bit later, Joseph's brothers decided to sell him to some passing merchants. He was then carted off to Egypt and sold as a slave to Potiphar. The brothers then dipped Joseph's coat in animal blood and showed it to Jacob, their father, who concluded that Joseph had been killed by a wild animal. That's a high-level overview of how most people remember the story. Now, of course, there's more to the narrative than what we remember from Sunday school. This narrative in particular is filled with all sorts of surprising oddities. In this video, we're going to take a look at some of them and see where they take us. Let's start with one particular detail right at the end of the story. Just who sold Joseph to Potiphar? Some merchants for sure, but who? When we get into the narrative, we find that there are not one, but two groups of merchants. The first to be mentioned are the Ishmaelites in verse 25, which says, "Then they," that is, Joseph's brothers, "sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin, on their way to carry it down to Egypt." The second group are the Midianites, who we come across in verse 28, which says, "When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt." Okay, maybe a little unexpected. So, who sold Joseph to Potiphar? The last verse of the chapter tells us it was the Midianites. In verse 36 it says, "Meanwhile the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard." But if we skip over the story of Judah and Tamar in chapter 38 and go to the opening of chapter 39, where we find the narrative about Joseph in the prison, we find that Potiphar bought Joseph from the Ishmaelites. In 39 verse 1 it says, "Now Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there." Oh no, a contradiction. Whatever are we going to do? Quick, find a verse that harmonizes the apparent contradiction and make it go away. The traditional solution to this problem is a couple of verses in Judges in the story of Gideon. Here's what the passage says. It's in Judges 8, verse 22 to 24. "Then the Israelites said to Gideon, 'Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have delivered us out of the hand of Midian.' Gideon said to them, 'I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you.' Then Gideon said to them, 'Let me make a request of you. Each of you give me an earring he has taken as booty.' For the enemy had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites." There you go. Gideon had just defeated the Midianites in battle and wanted their earrings to make a golden cult object. The narrative explains that these Midianites had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. Therefore, we can equate the Midianites with the Ishmaelites. At this point, apologists dust themselves off, declare victory, and move on. Problem solved, right? Isn't it like saying in one passage that the English person sold a slave, and in a different passage that the British person sold a slave? An English person is British, so the terms can be used interchangeably, right? Well, I guess you could do that. It would still read weirdly. I mean, why not just stick with one term? Why chop and change between Midianites and Ishmaelites? The thing is, this solution just doesn't work. It's not a solution. You can't have the Midianites be Ishmaelites in this passage. Why? Let's read verse 28 carefully. "When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt." There you go. The Midianites pulled Joseph up out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites. Who was Joseph sold to? The Midianites sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites. That's the plain reading of the text. The Midianites and the Ishmaelites had to be different groups to be able to sell and buy Joseph respectively. I mean, unless they sold Joseph to themselves, an absolutely ridiculous idea. Just a quick aside. For those not using the NRSV, ESV or Common English Bible, you may have noticed something odd. The NIV reads a little differently to what we've quoted above. It reads, "So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites. So in the NIV, it's not the Midianites who pulled Joseph out of the pit, as we read in the NRSV and ESV, but Joseph's brothers. The otherwise usually excellent New English translation even has a translation note explaining that the referent, Joseph's brothers, has been specified in the translation for clarity. Otherwise, the reader might assume the Midianites had pulled Joseph from the cistern. Instead of saying they drew Joseph up, the NET, NLT, and NIV, amongst other translations, tell us that Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the pit. The thing is, that's not what the underlying Hebrew says at all. The fairest translation really is they, not Joseph's brothers. The UBS Handbook on Genesis is clear about that, and it says, they represents the Hebrew text. Sure, down through the ages, all sorts of attempts have been made to try to make they not refer to the Midianites, but to Joseph's brothers. We haven't got time to get into the history now, but if you're interested, then you can't do much better than Joel Baden's composition of the Pentateuch, which we'll get to in a bit. The thing is, just because lots of people have tried all sorts of different ways to torture the text into saying that Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the pit, it doesn't make it so. Another way to ask the question, to really ram the point home, is this. Just who did the Midianites sell Joseph to? Either they sold him to the Ishmaelites, and we read that in verse 28, which we've already read a few times, which says, when some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. Or they sold him to the Egyptians, in verse 36. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar. The Midianites couldn't sell Joseph to both the Ishmaelites and the Egyptians. Once they'd sold Joseph, that was it. They can't sell him again. This isn't Wall Street. So hopefully it's clear that there are some real difficulties here in the text, difficulties that can't honestly be easily explained away. These are, at least on the face of it, flat contradictions. Joseph had been sold to Potiphar by both Ishmaelites and Midianites, and the Midianites had sold Joseph to both Ishmaelites and Egyptians. It's almost like there are two stories woven together in one text. Here's the interesting thing. Though those 2 points are the most obviously contradictory in the narrative, it doesn't stop there. There are more oddities where there are two versions of a particular point in the narrative. Let's take a look at a few of them. What account does Joseph give for how he ended up in Egypt? It turns out there are two different accounts. Here's what he said after interpreting the cupbearer's dream while he was in prison. In Genesis 40 verse 15 it says, "For in fact I was stolen out of the land of the Hebrews." There you go, Joseph said he'd been stolen. That's a reference to the action of the Midianites that we read in chapter 37 verse 28. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites. There's no mention of Joseph's brothers selling him to the Midianites. It quite plainly says that the Midianites just turned up, took Joseph out of the pit and sold him on. The Midianites kidnapped Joseph and trafficked him, explaining why Reuben was surprised to find the pit empty. Joseph had been stolen by the Midianites, just as he'd explained to the cupbearer, "For in fact I was stolen out of the land of the Hebrews." However, after all those years in Egypt, when Joseph finally revealed who he was to his famine-stricken brothers who had come down from Canaan looking for food, here's what he said to them. In chapter 45, verse 4, it says, "Then Joseph said to his brothers, 'Come closer to me.' And they came closer. He said, 'I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt.'" So this time, instead of being kidnapped, the narrative has Joseph reminding his brothers that they'd sold him into Egypt. This is quite different to being stolen by the Midianites. He'd been sold by his brothers rather than kidnapped by the Midianites. Two versions of a narrative explaining a particular outcome, Joseph's arrival in Egypt. There are more elements of the story for which we're given two versions. How many times do we hear Joseph's brothers conspire to kill him? Twice. The first reads like a summary statement in verse 18, which says, "They saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him." In the very next couple of verses, we find them conspiring to kill him again. In verse 19 and 20 it says, "They said to one another, 'Here comes this dreamer, come now, let us kill him.'" Could the second instance be the detailed version of the first? I guess. Let's take a look at another event that we've got two versions of, the decision to throw Joseph into a pit. The first instance is in verse 20, which says, "Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits." However, we then find Reuben just a couple of verses later suggesting the very same thing. Verse 22 says, "Reuben said to them, 'Shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness.'" Are these verses two versions of the same event? I guess you could read it as Reuben tweaking the initial plan a bit. Let's take a look at another event that we've got two versions of, the two arguments put forward for saving Joseph's life. The first is Reuben's. The narrative informs us in verse 21 and 22, "But when Reuben heard it," the plan to kill Joseph, "he delivered him out of their hands, saying, 'Let us not take his life.' Reuben said to them, 'Shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father.'" So Reuben's argument had an ulterior motive. He wanted to save Joseph's life. However, what's the reason he gave to his brothers? That they themselves shouldn't kill him with their own hands. Shed no blood, lay no hand on him. Instead, throw him into a pit, and we can only assume let him drown. These pits were cisterns. So Joseph would not have ended up dead, but would have remained alive, ready for Reuben to rescue him later. There's another argument made for saving Joseph's life. We find it in the words of Judah. In verse 26 and 27 it says, "Then Judah said to his brothers, 'What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh.'" So this time it's Judah who said that they shouldn't kill Joseph with their own hands, not lay our hands on him. He is our brother, he is our own flesh. The wording is not exactly the same as Reuben's, but it's very similar indeed. Can we explain this away by saying that Reuben tried to save Joseph from being murdered by his brothers by sticking him in the pit, and then Judah tried to save Joseph from drowning in the pit by selling him? I guess you could try to reconcile it that way. And that's the point. Each of these last few examples of an event in the narrative where we've got two versions of it could be explained away individually. But when there are two versions of many, if not most of the major points in the narrative, and there are a couple of points that are flatly contradictory, you've got to start wondering if what we're really dealing with here isn't a hopelessly contradictory passage, but rather two stories that have been woven together or interleaved rather like a zip. After all, each of these points of contradiction actually does seem to line up with other points of contradiction. Let's take a look at a couple of examples of that. The first is that Judah's argument for selling Joseph makes perfect sense in the context of the Ishmaelite merchants hoving into view, but less sense with the Midianites who just find Joseph in the pit and pull him out. The second is Reuben's surprise that Joseph was no longer in the pit lines up nicely with the Midianites stealing him, but doesn't line up so nicely with Joseph being sold by his brothers. There's just nothing in the text to suggest that Reuben had left his brothers alone for a period. It's for these reasons and more that the vast majority of scholars agree that Genesis 37 is the work of a redactor who took two different documents, each telling the same story with slightly different details, and wove them together into the final form that exists in our Bibles today. Based on this hypothesis, scholars look for what's called narrative continuity and discontinuity, which is bits of the text that flow and bits that don't, bits that line up and bits that don't, bits that make sense in the immediate context and bits that don't, bits that make sense in the wider context and bits that don't. Basically, where there are flat contradictions, they are split up into separate sources. Once that's happened, the rest of the narrative is normally easily split up into those sources, and two or more cohesive and non-contradictory narratives fall out. And Genesis 37 is a classic example. It goes something like this. There is, as we've seen, a flat contradiction around who sold Joseph into Egypt, and another flat contradiction around who the Midianites sold Joseph to. As we've already pointed out, each side of these contradictions lines up with other contradictions, and when we line them up, we get the following. In what we'll call story A, the Ishmaelites arrive on the scene in chapter 37 verse 25, and somehow coming into possession of Joseph, sell him to Potiphar in Egypt. In what we'll call story B, the Midianites discover Joseph in the pit, pull him out, and head on to Egypt, where they sell him to Potiphar. These are our two stories. Story A about the Ishmaelites, story B about the Midianites. Having split the text into two stories, it now remains to shuffle around the rest of the text into those two stories. We can start with Reuben. As we mentioned earlier, the fact he's surprised lines up well with story B, the Midianite kidnap of Joseph, so we'll file those verses under that. Since Reuben's ruse was to throw Joseph into a pit to save the brothers from killing Joseph with their bare hands, it's implicit that the idea of throwing Joseph into the pit, at least as far as the brothers were concerned, was in order to kill him. The Judah narrative doesn't line up with that. His plan was to sell Joseph to the passing Ishmaelites, and you don't do that by selling a drowned carcass. So Judah's plan belongs to story A. Reuben had identified a particular dry pit, so that one is spoken of in the singular, so that fits with story B. But the initial mention of pits is in the plural, since it doesn't matter which one you hide a dead body in. That fits well with story A. The initial plan to explain away Joseph's death by claiming he'd been killed by a wild animal is in the context of the planned sale to the Ishmaelites, and so fits with story A. It makes sense then that mention of the brothers taking Joseph's coat and the later verses explaining Jacob's reaction to it also belong to story A. Finally, since the Ishmaelites end up selling Joseph, they need to have gained possession of him. For that to happen, after the Midianite kidnap has been assigned to story A, it basically leaves as the only possibility that the brothers really did sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites. And since the brothers' first plan was to throw Joseph's dead body into a pit, and since they couldn't have sold a dead body into slavery, it turns out that the brothers cannot have thrown Joseph into any pit at all. Now, if your head is spinning after all that, I'm with you. It can take serious mental effort to think through all this. It really hurts my head. But by following this exercise through, by assigning the text of each side of a contradiction or tension to story A or B, we eventually end up with two similar but distinct and different narratives explaining how Joseph ended up in Egypt. Now, since I'm nothing but an uneducated and untrained, over-enthusiastic amateur, I'll give you what Joel Baden, professor of Hebrew Bible at Yale Divinity School, proposes are the two original texts behind Genesis 37, verses 17 to 36. I'm taking these from his excellent book, The Composition of the Pentateuch, which you should just really go out and buy right now. He deals with this passage much better than I have. Anyway, here's Baden's story A. They said to one another, "Here comes that dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we can say, 'A savage beast has devoured him.' We shall see what comes of his dreams." When Joseph came up to his brothers, they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the ornamented tunic that he was wearing. Looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, their camels bearing gum, balm, and ladanum to be taken to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What do we gain by killing our brother and covering up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, but let us not do away with him ourselves. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh." His brothers agreed. They sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites who brought Joseph to Egypt. Then they took Joseph's tunic, slaughtered a kid, and dipped the tunic in the blood. They had the ornamented tunic taken to their father, and they said, "We found this. Please examine it. Is it your son's tunic or not?" He recognized it and said, "My son's tunic. A savage beast devoured him. Joseph was torn by a beast." Jacob rent his clothes, put sackcloth on his loins, and observed mourning for his son many days. All his sons and daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, saying, "No, I will go down mourning to my son in Sheol." Thus his father bewailed him. That all makes sense. It all lines up. There's nothing in there that's contradictory. And if you're not paying much attention, it fits well with the story that we remember from Sunday school. Now let's take a look at what Baden says is story B. They saw him from afar, and before he came close to them, they conspired to kill him. But when Reuben heard it, he tried to save him from them. He said, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben went on, "Shed no blood. Cast him into that pit out in the wilderness, but do not touch him yourselves," intending to save him from them and restore him to his father. They took him and cast him into the pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Then they sat down to a meal. When Midianite traders passed by, they pulled Joseph up out of the pit. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he rent his clothes. Returning to his brothers, He said, "The boy is gone, now what am I to do?" The Midianites, meanwhile, sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, a courtier of Pharaoh and his chief steward. Again, that too lines up very well. There's nothing contradictory in it, and it is remarkably similar to what I and many others remember from Sunday school. It's really hard to tell the difference between the two stories when you listen to them. So, after all that, hopefully it's clear why scholars have come to the conclusion that what we're dealing with here in Genesis 37 is two separate documents that were subsequently woven together. It's my belief that that's the only conclusion you can come to after a careful and honest reading of the passage.